Welcome to The Art of Medicine, the program that explores the arts, business, and clinical aspects of the practice of medicine. I'm your host, Dr. Andrew Wilner. Just a little note, I think I finally figured out SRT files, so I'm adding timed transcripts to each podcast, which makes for easy reading or reference. Let me know if this is a worthwhile addition. There's a button you can press on your phone for feedback. Today, I'm pleased to welcome Eric Garcia. Eric is the author of We're Not Broken, Changing the Autism Conversation. I heard Eric speak on another podcast, Uniquely Human, named after the best-selling book by Barry Prizant about people with autism. Eric is a successful journalist who covers Washington, D.C., and he knows the political scene inside and out. He's particularly knowledgeable about how legislation affects people with disabilities, and more specifically, people like himself who are autistic. I'm looking forward to a very meaningful discussion in just a few moments. But first, a word from our sponsor, locumstory.com. Locumstory.com is a free, unbiased educational resource about locum tenens. It's not an agency. Locum Story answers your questions on their website, podcast, webinars, videos, and they even have a Locums 101 crash course. Learn about locums and get insights from real-life physicians, PAs, and NPs at locumstory.com. And now to my guest. Welcome, Eric Garcia.
Thank you for having me.
Eric, let's talk first about your profession. Give
Yeah,
me an idea of your daily routine.
mostly my daily routine mostly constitutes so 3 out of 5 days of the week. I'm typically on Capitol Hill. Typically I try to get there by around 10 a.m. Morning, I typically message my boss to say this is what's going on. And I try to get to Capitol Hill around 10 in the morning. Try to get there for votes, try to talk to lawmakers, try to work on stories that we have cooking up, and then also I write our newsletter Inside Washington, which is kind of our breakdown. It's kind of interesting because I'm the Washington bureau chief at the Independent, which is of course a lot of people see it as a British newspaper. We see ourselves as a global newspaper that's based out of the United Kingdom. Which is funny because I actually haven't been to London. I haven't been to the United Kingdom ever. But the I want to though. But I think that what we're trying to do is we're trying to explain why what's going on in Washington affects the rest of the world. And look, for better or for worse, America is still the leading superpower in the globe. So what we do matters. We set what the president says and does matters. What Congress does matters. Um, and really, what I try to do is with our White House reporter Andrew Feinberg and our campaign reporter John Bowden and a few of our other reporters, we try to kind of demystify and explain it to a global audience to say why, beyond the headlines of the tit for tat, what the he said, she said, why what's going on matters and what does it mean for the day to day around the world. And I think that's kind of what we do. So I lead our newsletter. And on top of that, right now, especially with the Trump administration, I've been doing a lot of work coverage on not just Secretary of Health and Human Services Robert F. Kennedy Jr., but also all of the sub bureaucracies within the Health and Human Services Department. So, the Administration for Community Living, Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, the Department, the National Institutes of Health, and then also what kind of legislation is governing it. So, there's a big fight right now that's getting ready to happen about Medicaid. So, covering that as well.
Okay, sounds like a busy day,
Yeah,
and
and that's not during election season.
we're recording this April 28th. So I think no matter where you are in the world, and particularly in the United States, I know today I think they're voting in Canada, and Trump has had a big impact there,
Yeah,
and really all over the world. We all feel that. I
yeah,
wanna I wanna just seg a little bit to your book.
yeah.
We're Not Broken. After I heard you speak, and I thought it was a book worth reading, and I read it. It's written by a journalist.
Yeah.
There's a lot of documentation and references. I think it's a very well researched book. There's a lot of information there. But before we kind of get into the book itself, tell me why did you write it?
Yes, I mean, I'm autistic, like a lot, that was really kind of the impetus to that. But what was really the beginning was about 10 years ago, I was at a party, um, and a guy by the name of Tim Mack, who's a really great journalist, he offered me a drink at his party, and I said, "Oh, I don't drink because I'm on the autism spectrum, and some of the medicine I take doesn't mix." And instead of him saying, "Come on, have a drink," he said, "Oh, there's a lot of autistic people in Washington, D.C. You should write something about that."
Mm.
And I thought, look, I'm really early in my career. I don't want this to be about me. You're taught in journalism school, don't make yourself the story. And then what happened was I was working at National Journal at the time. I was covering economics and politics. That was a great job. That was probably my favorite job I've ever had. It was funny because like that job early on, like, you would go to financial regulation conferences and you would see Elizabeth Warren, and you go to labor conferences and you'd see Bernie Sanders. And so when Bernie Sanders decided to run for president, like I met a lot of the people who would go on to work for his campaign. But like what happened was the magazine they decided to David Bradley, the owner of the magazine, decided to shut down the print edition of the magazine, put everything behind a paywall so you could only pay to read all the stuff. And so, you know, everybody was deciding to leave. And then what happened was the print magazine editor, a guy by the name of Richard Just, who had been an editor at the New Republic and at Newsweek, he basically said, I want, all you guys to pitch whatever stories you want to me, because I'm going to be out of a job at the end of the year. So I pitched that story idea, and initially it was going to kind of be like, I don't know, like the secret lives of people in Washington. Because Washington D.C. is such a city where like socialization is so important. Like this last weekend was White House Correspondents' Dinner weekend, and like, going to the parties, you know, yes, the parties are fun, but like it's also like you're working. Like I'm handing out business cards. I'm getting business cards. These are just a few of the business cards I got. So I'm sending out emails right now, like literally right before I talk to you, just to follow up with people I met. And that was kind of the plan. It was kind of going to be this kind of like talk of the town kind of piece, this kind of talk of the town kind of piece. And then Richard, God love him, said, "Why does this piece need to exist?" And I said, "Well, I think we focus too much on trying to cure autism and not enough on trying to help autistic people live more fulfilling lives." And he's like, "There's your piece, go." And initially he said I wanted to be 10,000 words. I turned in like 14,000 words. And then or 12,000 words. And then we cut it down to like 6,500 words. And the reason why, and then it was funny because all the while, Donald Trump is getting ready to run for president. This is in 2015. And is that, if you remember, Trump was saying in one of the first debates, he says, autism has become an epidemic. It has become something, and he talked about the vaccines. And, the thing that I thought was, okay, look, Trump is a liar and he peddles conspiracy theories. But I grew up in Southern California, and there are a lot of people who vote Democratic who believe the same thing he does. And the reason why I did, and then so what my feeling was, and I still believe it, is that almost any conversation began about autism in Washington began or ended with vaccines. And my feeling was, and I still feel this way, is that like it is so divorced from what autistic people really need. It is divorced from, discussions about autistic people being able to get a job or being able to um, be able to get out of poverty or transition into adulthood or any of the other stuff that we haven't been able to that autistic people really need. And I think that what I wanted to do, the reason why I said changing the autism conversation, is I wanted to move on from that because like the vaccine autism thing has been debunked thoroughly. Study after study, the guy who put out the original study lost his medical license, had the study retracted. I wanted to just move on from that. And what's funny is if you read the actual book, which I know you did, Andrew, you notice I don't mention Robert F. Kennedy Jr. in the hardcover edition. I mentioned him in the paperback, but only once. And the reason why I did that is because I just thought that we'd already moved on from it. And, the book came out in 2021. Never in my wildest dreams would I have expected RFK Jr. to become Health and Human Services Secretary. So now I feel like it's more relevant than ever.
Yes. And, this is a medical show, and we'll just say that autism is not caused
Yep.
by vaccinations. And as you stated, this has been proved. It's kind of like, our brain tumors caused by cell phones. It's one of those things that never goes away. They do
Yeah.
research and they say it doesn't. And then 5 years later, somebody says, oh, yeah, but that cell phone, it's right where the brain tumor was. And then they want to spend millions of dollars again to research it and prove that it's true when it isn't. So autism has nothing to do with vaccinations. Little kids do get autism and little kids do get vaccinations, but it's just one of those things. It's not, it's association, but not causality. So you're right. Time to move on. But now we're back. Jay, there was just, there for those who are following current events, right? So now there's a new investigation spearheaded by RFK that we're going to show that autism is caused by something, and the subtext is it's probably vaccinations, and
Yeah, or
we're going to do
I
it
was
by
at his
September,
yeah, I
right?
was at his press conference 2 weeks ago, and he also said it could be environmental factors. Um, you
All right,
know,
so we left the door open. We left
he
the
left
door
the
open.
door open to saying it wasn't the vaccine. That's progress.
That's progress. Now, I want to make this a little more personal. You self-identify as a person with autism. Is that
Correct.
correct? All right.
Correct.
So we're talking. We're having a pretty, I would say, usual conversation here. Why? What makes you a person with autism? What does that mean?
I mean, I think that one of the main things is that I still deal with sensory processing. So for example, I don't drive a car. I um I try to take mass transit, but even then, for example, I mentioned I try to get to Capitol Hill by 10 a.m. The reason why I do it is because I can't get on the train by rush hour because there's flashing lights, all the people packed in like sardines, things like that. I have to make sure that, my lights are low enough in my apartment. Uh, I think that also, like, I still have a great deal of difficulty with socialization and kind of interactions and reading social cues. It takes a lot of work. One thing I'm like, I'm looking straight into the camera right now. I'm actually not talking, making eye contact with you right now, doctor. I think that also, like, there are certain things that are, I think I still deal with overstimulation. And so I think that, but like to the point. And I think what was really important for me when I wrote this book, when I wrote my first book, and I'm writing my second book now, is to really try to get a good perspective on the entire spectrum, a good perspective on the entire spectrum of autism. So I made sure when I was writing my first book to really include as many autistic people of any permutation as I could. So I included non-speaking autistic people. I included speaking autistic people. I included autistic people who with intellectual disabilities. I included women and people of color and transgender people. I think that, to your point that my book is a book by a journalist. I'm very, very aware that my experience is not the entire experience, not the experience writ large of autistic people. And one of the things that I did when somebody approached me about writing a book is I said I don't want this to be a memoir. I was 25 when I began writing the book proposal. And I think that my feeling was, look, I'm 25 years old. I don't have anything interesting to say, as far as a memoir. Like, I'm 25 for God's sakes. And I'm 34 now. And I tend to think that if you're writing a memoir at 25, you've got a problem, or you're incredibly self-involved. But my feeling is, but my feeling was as a journalist, um, and the more I thought about it, the more that I realized, like, I didn't get to where I am by accident. I didn't get to where I am because, I'm particularly accomplished or good looking, certainly. But, like, I think that what I thought was like, oh, like, when I started looking at all the policies around people with disabilities, I realized, like, okay, I was born in 1990. I was born the year that the Americans with Disabilities Act was signed by a Republican president and passed by a Democratic Congress. That was the same year that the Education for Handicapped Children Act became what is now the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. So I've never known a world where my rights as a disabled person were not codified. Now, codified does not mean enacted, you know. Just because something is the letter of the law doesn't mean that it's actually, put in place. And I think that that was one of the things that really kind of shaped me was like and I think what kind of motivates me as a political journalist is recognizing that the language of my life has been policy. Um, and I think that that was kind of what motivated me to write this book.
It's hard. I think it's difficult to talk about autism because of the spectrum.
Yes.
And I'm a neurologist, and I wrote a book a number of years ago about epilepsy.
Yeah.
And epilepsy affects some people in a very mild way. They might have one seizure a year. They take medicine, their seizures are controlled, and they live pretty much a regular life, indistinguishable from anybody else, except they take a couple pills a day.
Yeah.
But on the other end, there are people who have multiple seizures a day, who
Yeah.
have severe disabilities, and they all fall under this category of
Yeah.
epilepsy. And it was very difficult to sort of put, how do you write a book for such a diverse audience? So tell us what you think about this concept of the autistic spectrum.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. My friend John Marble probably put it to me the same way, the way that I think about it. You mentioned epilepsy. It's one of the biggest killers of autistic people, as you know. Um, Epilepsy, I think like a third of all autistic people have epilepsy. And I think the biggest killer of autistic people with intellectual disabilities. So I think it was really important when I was writing my book to include as many voices. But I think the reason why it's so important to talk about a spectrum is A, you want to include as many people as possible, but B, I think that a lot of people, when they think of a spectrum, they tend to think of like to left to right, more autistic or less autistic. Whereas really, it's more like a color wheel. A lot
Hmm.
of people said this, and I think in the same way, we've seen that so one of the examples that I use all the time, and I write about it in my first book, is there's this one woman who I profile. Her name is Aria. She's speaking. She is married. She has children. But she couldn't graduate college. She had trouble in school. Like, and a lot of it was ableism. A lot of it was like, she had a disability, but like she just didn't get the proper supports. And she had trouble finding work. And then conversely, I interviewed this young man by the name of Hari Srinivasan, who was not speaking, has, multiple accommodation needs, high support needs. And, for the longest time, was put through a lot of therapies, trying to force him to learn how to speak, things like that. But then he communicates now with a communication device. And he graduated from Cal, and he's now from Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley. And now he's a graduate student at Vanderbilt University. So tell me which one is the low functioning and which is the high functioning autistic person. And I think that that's why I'm not a fan of those terms because I think that they focus more on what we see uh, on the outside rather than what we see, what's going on in here and what's going on in here. Studies have shown that autistic people, even non-speaking autistic people, learn and process things as much, and they can understand what people are saying about them just as much as anybody else. And I think that that's what I want to say is that, I think that when we talk about high functioning and low functioning, we really are doing a disservice to ourselves, and really we're doing a disservice to autistic people because what we're doing when we say somebody is low functioning as an autistic person, we are writing them off in society. We're dismissing the ability for them to do anything or accomplish anything. And of course, they would still have worth and value even if they never played baseball or wrote a poem, as RFK Jr. likes to say. But on top of that, we often just write off their ability to do it, I don't do anything at all. And I think conversely, when we say somebody is high functioning autistic, we do a disservice to them because then we don't give them the accommodations or supports that they need because they're high functioning, they might not need that much. You understand this is a doc. He said like they take a couple pills. Well, you still, if you're with epilepsy, you still need to take your pills. You still need insurance. You still need adequate access to healthcare. If you don't have a job, you still need Medicaid. Um, and my friend John Marble, who's autistic, he said it best, and and I use this term a lot. Being autistic is a lot like being French, which is to say that a fashion designer in Paris is going to be very different from a nun in Bordeaux versus a farmer in the Champagne region. But if they were to all have lunch at the near the Champs-Élysées, they would have this esprit de corps. They would understand, had this common understanding of what it means to be a Frenchman or Frenchwoman. And then you and I, we're Americans, but whereas look, I'm an American. I grew up in Southern California. But you know, if I were to hang out with my friends who I went to college with in North Carolina, and you know, some of my friends who live in Brooklyn and some of my friends who live in Florida, we would still have this common understanding as being Americans. It's a little bit more divided these days, but you know, I see that kind of the same thing with autism, you know.
Let me ask you, you mentioned there's some practical ways that the autism gets in the way of you
Yeah.
getting to work on time, and you have to basically accommodate yourself by
Yeah.
taking the bus at a later hour. Are there any ways in which autism has helped your career?
Yeah, I mean, I think it kind of helps me with like kind of focusing singularly on something like what is a journalism beat but a special interest. Um,
Right. So hyper focus, that's one of the
yeah,
qualities, right, of people with autism is they have these special interests or hyper focus or it's
yeah, no, like I genuinely love and live for campaigns and looking at election data, looking at FEC data. I tend to think that that's like such an instructive um, bellwether. You know, it was funny. Like just a few weeks ago, I was looking through campaign data, and I noticed that Senator Dick Durbin had not raised a lot of money, and I was like, "Oh, this might be a sign that he might be getting ready to retire." And like a week later, he announced he was not running for re-election. Like, you know, you could just tell that if somebody is 80 years old and is not fundraising when they're up for re-election, you could just tell that they're not running for re-election. And in the same respect, I think that like, you know, I'm not somebody who's like that good at like talking to people on background or things like that. You know, like I'm good at like asserting myself. So like when I went to that press conference with RFK Jr., I parked myself immediately up in front of him so that he couldn't ignore me and that I would be the first person to get a question. In the same way I do that at press conferences with Speaker Mike Johnson, with House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, or any kind of, and I'm good at somebody who's I'm good at not taking no for an answer. I'm good at kind of like making sure that I get somebody to answer my question, even when even when they're kind of trying to dodge, you know, or doge these days, as they say these days. Uh, but like, I mean, I think I think also like, as an autistic person who kind of finds, you know, socializing and social interactions really weird, I think it kind of allows me to take a step back and look at like kind of the whole board, just because this is kind of a foreign language to me. So I think those are some ways.
I, you know, the numbers now are approximately, I think they just revised them about
1 in 31.
1 in 31. So that's roughly 3 in 100.
Yeah.
And so there are a lot of parents out there that have, little children, 2 years old, 3 years old, and they send them to school and the kid has trouble and the principal comes and talks to them and says, I think you need to have your child tested. Your your child is not doing well in our pre-K. Might be autistic. I'm not the one to say, but we would like to refer you for some testing. And until that's accomplished, please don't come back. And what what kind of advice would you give to parents who are facing a new diagnosis of autism in their beautiful little,
Yeah,
toddler?
what I would say is that now is that, you know, don't be afraid of the label. You know, I hear a lot of parents say, "Oh, we don't want to give our kids a label of being autistic." The label is also a roadmap, you know? As soon as you as soon as you know what kind of brain your kid is working with, then you realize, oh, they're not, you know, I think about it because like even I got diagnosed when I was 8, you know, when autism, a lot of the public understanding around autism was kind of changing in the 90s. And I think that like that was so incredibly helpful. And also like at the same time, I don't envy any parents right now because like, you know, there's so much misinformation, so much disinformation, especially now, you know, given the current administration. But I really do think that giving that, like, if you have that roadmap, then you realize, like, I think about what I was trying to make is that, like, it wasn't until I got older and I met a lot of other autistic people that I realized, oh, I'm not a bad person. I'm not lazy. I'm not maladaptive. You know, this is just how my brain works. And then I learned and I tailored, you know, to your point, like I said, I kind of self-accommodate.
Hmm.
Like it's really funny how for all of the talk about how autistic people are inflexible or they don't or they're intransigent or they're not good with adjusting to change. Autistic people are remarkable in their ability to self-innovate and self-accommodate and come up with things to almost contort themselves to make other people, to make neurotypical people comfortable. And I think that what I would say is that nowadays you now have a society where there are enough autistic elders and autistic adults who are resources, who are willing to help, who are willing to be on the war footing with you, not to like combat or fix autism, but just to like fight and protect your kids and make sure that you have the supports you need and to fight for the resources you need. I've said that like, right now, autistic people kind of we autistic people, their parents, their educators, their loved ones, their doctors and everybody else right now needs to be on a war footing given how much misinformation is being spread right now around autism. And I think that right now, more than ever, getting an autism diagnosis is so important. But like also, unfortunately, what I would say is like I totally like I wouldn't begrudge any parent who is afraid of giving their kids the label right now just because we're seeing so much misinformation and so much stigmatization. But I would say that in the aggregate, getting a diagnosis is much more important, even in a really, really fraught time such as this.
Doctors always recommend pediatricians when the diagnosis is made, say in a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old, or in your case, 8, early intervention. We need to do therapies. What helped you the most?
Yeah, so I was in occupational therapy a lot. ADA, even though it's been around since the 70s, that wasn't really something that was practiced. We did a lot of occupational therapy. We did this thing. I remember when I was a kid, we did this thing called handwriting with no tears. And when I'm telling you, it's funny. My mom was the one who recalled it earlier today, or last week with me when we were talking, and she was like, it was so important because that was the first time somebody could understand your handwriting, and you won an award for your writing because you wrote about what it was like. We were living in Texas at the time, and you wanted to be an astronaut, and you wrote about what it must be like to be in space. And so I think about that. And again, the point that I make is that that was part of when I was living in Texas at the time when George W. Bush was governor of Texas. And the reason why I say that was important is that George W. Bush, a Republican, the son of George H.W. Bush, believed in special education and believed in disability education and poured a ton of money into it. I wouldn't be where I am. And had it not been for those accommodations, I wouldn't have had the opportunity to, I would have still, people still would have thought I'm a bad student and I wasn't good at writing because my handwriting was illegible. But it was because of that I was able to succeed. It was because of that somebody recognized that I was a good writer, and that's how I have a job as a writer today.
So there was these accommodations were extra time, some
Yeah,
one-on-one teaching, so someone
yeah.
could help you with your handwriting. What? Give me an example. What were these other accommodations that were made that help you develop?
Yeah, so like when I was in college, you said extra time and extra I was able to take my tests specifically for math in a quiet setting, and that was the only way. I mean, I still got a C in math, but like for some of them, but like I still was able to pass. And it showed that like, if I was given the opportunities and I was given the same chances, I didn't get any help on these tests. It's not like I had somebody looking over my shoulder giving me the answers. But just like having that extra time and being in a quiet space allowed me to even succeed and have a fighting chance to graduate college.
Which you did.
Yes, I did. I went to the University of North Carolina, baby.
All right, let's get back to your book. What's been the response to your book?
Yeah, I mean, so I mean, there are always people who are always going to, be critical and things like that. But for the most part, it's been really positive. And I think what's really funny is that, so I published the book in 2021, and it was really interesting because I published it. We published it later because we were hoping that COVID would be over. And then,
Mm.
if you remember, like, you remember how glorious April 2021 was when we were all getting vaccinated and we were going to restaurants. That was an amazing time. And then Delta hit, and then so most of the events I did in August of 2021 were remote. I think I only did one in-person event, two actually. I did one in-person event at the University of Delaware, and I did another at the University of Chicago. But then what was funny was it wasn't until 2022 when the paperback edition came out that I started getting a lot more feedback on it. And then more people started reading it, and I think a lot of people really started to realize what I was doing. And I think it might also like take into account that might be selection bias because like, look, if you're writing a book, if you're reading a book by an autistic person saying we're not broken, you're more likely to believe that like autistic people are fine as they are. Like that might just be selection bias. But I think for the most part, it's been mostly positive. And it's really something. I mean, and now, ironically enough, I've kind of carved out a niche for myself in Washington writing about autism, especially in this kind of weird time with Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
Well, there's so many topics I want to broach. This is a difficult one, and I just want your take on it. And you mentioned it in the book that there seems to be a relative increase in the number of people who identify with the LGBTQ plus sort of
Correct.
domain in the autism population.
Yeah.
Can you make any sense out of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I often joke that when I'm on autism, when I go to autism conferences as a cisgender straight dude, I'm often in the minority. And I'm only half kidding, but like, I mean, I think it totally makes sense because, a lot study after study has shown that a large chunk of autistic people, more than the general population, do not identify as cisgender or heterosexual. And I think one reason why that's the case is I think that a lot of autistic people I actually think a lot more autistic people are a lot more comfortable coming out than like the general population. I mean, I
Mm.
can't say that, I'm not a researcher, I'm not a doctor, I don't have a PhD or anything like that. But I think a large reason is that like if you're autistic, you're more like gender norms and sexual norms, what are they? They're social norms. So you're more willing to question them if you're autistic. You're more willing to question why do I believe this? Why do people do this? Why do even like even when I was a teenager, I was like, am I sure I'm a guy? Like, how do I know I'm not a woman? Because I knew trans people. And then like I was like, and then I was like, am I sure that I'm attracted to women? And then like, and then like, and then like after a certain amount of time, I was like, oh no, I am attracted to women. Um, but like, and I could see how if you're trans, I mean, how if you're autistic, you might be more willing to examine those kind of social norms, and you could realize, oh yeah, I really am trans, or I really am non-binary, or I really am gay or bisexual. And I think that I think that like, or I think that just you're willing more because like these social norms are just not a native language to you. You're more willing to examine and question them. Just like how, if you are a black person, you're more likely to think about whiteness and power structures within that exist within whiteness. Or if you're a woman, you're more likely to examine gender norms and gender hierarchies. Or if you're an immigrant, the kind of what are the kind of privileges and rights and benefits that come with being a native born American versus being a naturalized citizen. So I think those are all kind of the contributing factors. But like what worries me the most is that like I worry that a lot of bad faith actors are using the fact that a lot of people in the LGBTQ community identify as autistic as an impetus to kind of restrict their ability to live their lives fully.
Right. So it could magnify the stigma.
Yes,
Yeah, that would be unfortunate. I got one last question, and it's kind of a tough one. Suppose Pfizer comes out tomorrow and they announce that they have a pill that you can take and it will cure autism. Would you take it?
I I can only speak for myself. I don't think I would because I think it would be changing immutable traits. I would I would love if there were a pill that would help with sensory processing. I would love if there were a pill that can make it easier for me to drive a car. But I wouldn't change who I am. And that's a very different thing. Like I mean, I think that, it's funny. I live in Washington, D.C. And I used to live near H Street, which is where Gallaudet University is. And I met a lot of deaf people. I met deaf people, you just would see deaf people like they were my neighbors, or they worked as baristas. And a lot of deaf people are saying like would say like, no, I don't want to, cure my deafness. Or, a lot of people say that like, a lot of my friends use wheelchairs and they're like, no, I'm not wheelchair bound. Being in a wheelchair allows me to get around. I don't think I would change it at the same time. Like I go to what my friend John Ella Robinson says, like, we should mitigate the parts of autism that are incredibly disabling and magnify and celebrate the parts of autism that allow that allow people to live wonderful lives. I think that like, it was funny. I think a lot about like, so I play guitar a lot. That was what I wanted to do before I'm a journalist. I think about how much of how much great music comes from just accidents, little
Hmm.
happy accidents. How many songs were written because you were trying to play one thing and then you come up with another thing. And I think that getting rid of getting rid of autism, getting rid of any disability, whether it's Down syndrome or deafness or blindness, would erase what makes us human.
I love it, Eric. Um, okay, we're going to wind up. Is there anything you'd like to add?
Not at this moment, no. Thank you, though.
Eric Garcia, thanks for joining me on the Art of Medicine.
Thank you so much for having me, Andrew.
I'll just add that for those who would like to learn more about autism, I interviewed Temple Grandin, perhaps the best known person in the world with autism, and that was episode number 125 about 6 months ago. I also interviewed Emily Santagati, who works with the Centers of America, a company that offers ABA therapy, which has its own story, and that's episode number 76. And now, a final thanks to our sponsor, locumstory.com. Locum Story is a free, unbiased educational resource about locum tenens. It's not an agency. Locum Story exists to answer your questions about the how to's of locums on their website, podcast, webinars, and videos. They even have a Locums 101 crash course. At locumstory.com, you can discover if locum tenens make sense for you and your career goals. What makes locumstory.com unique is that it's peer-to-peer platform with real physicians sharing their experiences and stories, both the good and bad, about working locum tenens. Hence the name, Locum Story. Locumstory.com is a self-service tool that you can explore at your own pace with no pressure or obligation. It's completely free. Thanks again to locumstory.com for sponsoring this episode of The Art of Medicine. I'm Dr. Andrew Wilner. See you next time. This program is hosted, edited, and produced by Andrew Wilner, MD, FACP, FAAN. Guests receive no financial compensation for their appearance on The Art of Medicine. Andrew Wilner, MD, is Associate Professor of Neurology at the University of Tennessee Health Science Center, Memphis, Tennessee. Views, thoughts, and opinions expressed on this program belong solely to Dr. Wilner and his guests and not necessarily to their employers, organizations, or other group or individual. While this program intends to be informative, it is meant for entertainment purposes only. The Art of Medicine does not offer professional financial, legal, or medical advice. Dr. Wilner and his guests assume no responsibility or liability for any damages, financial or otherwise, that arise in connection with consuming this program's content. Thanks for watching. For more episodes of The Art of Medicine, please subscribe. www.andrewwilner.com